Marcus Rivera had been fixing cars for 23 years, and in all that time, he had never seen anything quite like what rolled into his garage on that humid Tuesday morning in El Paso, Texas. The black Escalade pulled up to Bay 3 with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested its occupants were in no hurry, a luxury that Marcus, with his mounting bills and dwindling customer base, could hardly afford to appreciate. At 45, Marcus had the weathered hands and permanent grease stains that marked him as a man who had spent his life working with his hands. His small auto repair shop, Rivera's Automotive, sat in a rundown part of town where legitimate businesses struggled to survive alongside the more profitable but dangerous enterprises that thrived in the shadows of the border economy. The two men who emerged from the Escalade were clearly not his usual customers. They wore expensive suits despite the desert heat, and their eyes swept the garage with the practiced assessment of men accustomed to evaluating threats and opportunities. The taller one, with graying temples and a gold tooth that caught the fluorescent light, approached Marcus with a smile that never reached his eyes. "You, Marcus Rivera?" the man asked, his accent carrying the subtle inflections of someone who had spent time on both sides of the border. "That's me," Marcus replied, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" "Name's Carlos Mendoza," the man said, extending a manicured hand. "We hear you're the best mechanic in El Paso. Discreet, reliable, doesn't ask too many questions." Marcus had heard those particular qualifications before, and they usually meant trouble. But trouble, unfortunately, often paid better than legitimate work, and Marcus had learned long ago that survival sometimes required making compromises with his conscience. "Depends on what kind of work you're talking about," Marcus said carefully. Carlos gestured toward the Escalade. "Vehicle modifications, special compartments, reinforced panels, enhanced suspension to handle ... additional weight. The kind of work that requires expertise and absolute confidentiality." Marcus understood immediately. In El Paso, there was only one type of business that required vehicles modified with hidden compartments capable of carrying significant weight across borders. The cartels had been using his neighborhood as a corridor for decades, and while Marcus had always tried to stay clear of their operations, the economic reality of his situation was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. His shop was 3 months behind on rent, his daughter Sophia needed money for her final semester of nursing school, and his ex-wife's medical bills from her cancer treatment continued to arrive with depressing regularity. The legitimate auto repair business barely kept the lights on, while the kind of work Carlos was suggesting could solve his financial problems in a matter of weeks. "What kind of timeline are we talking about?" Marcus asked, already knowing he was crossing a line he had sworn never to cross. 2 weeks for the initial modifications," Carlos replied. "Then, ongoing maintenance and additional vehicles as needed. The compensation would be ... substantial." Carlos reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope thick with cash. "This is just a down payment. Consider it a gesture of good faith." Marcus stared at the envelope, calculating rapidly. Even if it contained only a fraction of what the complete job would pay, it represented more money than he typically made in 3 months of legitimate work. "I'll need to see the vehicle first," Marcus said, his practical nature overriding his moral reservations. "Assess what kind of modifications you're looking for." Carlos nodded approvingly. "Smart man. Let's take a look." The Escalade was pristine on the outside, but when Carlos popped the hood, Marcus could see that it had already been extensively modified. The engine had been upgraded for performance, the suspension reinforced, and there were several areas where custom work had been done to accommodate hidden storage. "We need additional compartments," Carlos explained, running his hand along the vehicle's frame. "Larger capacity, better concealment, and fail-safes in case of unexpected inspections." Marcus examined the existing work with a professional eye. Whoever had done the previous modifications knew their business, but there were definitely improvements that could be made. His mind was already working through the technical challenges when Carlos made an observation that would change everything. "The previous mechanic who worked on our vehicles," Carlos said casually, "had an unfortunate accident. Seems he got curious about things that weren't his concern." The implied threat was clear, but Marcus was already too committed to back out. He needed the money, and he told himself that as long as he focused purely on the mechanical work and avoided asking questions about the cargo, he could maintain some semblance of moral distance from whatever activities these modifications would facilitate. "I understand," Marcus said. "Strictly mechanical work, no questions asked." "Excellent." Carlos smiled. "We'll leave the vehicle with you. Take your time, do quality work, and there will be many more opportunities for profitable collaboration." After the two men left, Marcus spent the rest of the day examining the Escalade more thoroughly. The existing modifications were sophisticated, involving custom fabricated panels that could be opened with hidden switches and compartments that were virtually undetectable to casual inspection. But Marcus could see ways to improve the design, make the storage more efficient, and create better concealment. As he worked, Marcus tried not to think about what would eventually be transported in the spaces he was creating. He focused instead on the technical challenges, the precision required, and the craftsmanship that would be necessary to create modifications that were both functional and undetectable. That evening, after closing the shop, Marcus sat in his small office reviewing his finances. The envelope Carlos had given him contained $5,000 in cash, more than enough to catch up on his rent and make a significant dent in his other debts. But it was also a down payment on a relationship that he knew would be difficult to escape once it began. His phone rang, interrupting his brooding. Sophia's voice was bright with excitement as she told him about her upcoming graduation from nursing school and her acceptance into a prestigious hospital residency program. The pride in her voice reminded Marcus of why he was willing to make these compromises. Sophia had worked incredibly hard to build a legitimate career, and he wasn't going to let financial problems derail her future. "Dad, I know things have been tight," Sophia said, her voice becoming more serious. "If you need help with money, don't worry about it, Mia," Marcus replied. "I've got some new contracts coming in, big jobs that will set us up nicely." After hanging up, Marcus stared at the cash on his desk. He told himself that this was temporary, that he would do a few jobs for Carlos and his associates, make enough money to stabilize his situation, and then return to legitimate work. It was a rationalization that many people in his situation had made, and like most of them, Marcus would soon discover that the cartels were not employers you could simply quit when convenient. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus threw himself into the modification work with the same dedication he brought to all his projects. He fabricated custom panels that fit seamlessly into the vehicle's existing structure, created hydraulic systems that could open and close the hidden compartments silently, and installed electronic controls that were virtually undetectable. The work was genuinely challenging and, despite its illicit purpose, Marcus found himself taking pride in the quality of his craftsmanship. He was creating something that was both mechanically sophisticated and artistically elegant, a perfect fusion of form and function that represented the best of his abilities as a craftsman. When Carlos returned to inspect the completed work, his approval was immediate and enthusiastic. "This is exceptional," Carlos said, running his hands over the seamless panels. "Better than anything we've had before." He handed Marcus another envelope, this one significantly thicker than the first. "Your reputation for quality work is well deserved. We have several more vehicles that will need similar modifications." Marcus counted the money later that evening, $15,000, more than he typically made in 6 months. For the first time in years, he was able to pay all his bills, send money to Sophia, and even set aside some savings. The relief was overwhelming, but it came with the growing realization that he was now deeply involved with people who would not easily let him walk away. What Marcus didn't know was that his exceptional work had attracted attention beyond Carlos and his immediate associates. The modifications he had created were so sophisticated that they had caught the eye of higher-level cartel leadership, people who dealt in quantities of money and drugs that dwarfed anything Marcus had imagined. And in 3 months, when a damaged vehicle would arrive at his shop containing a cargo that would change his life forever, Marcus would discover that sometimes the most dangerous discoveries are the ones you never intended to make. The black Escalade drove away from Rivera's Automotive that afternoon, carrying Marcus's finest work. But it also carried the seeds of a situation that would ultimately force a simple mechanic to make choices that would put him at odds with some of the most dangerous people in North America. Marcus locked up his shop that evening, feeling more financially secure than he had in years, but also carrying the weight of knowing that his life had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just a mechanic struggling to make ends meet. He was now a valuable asset to people who protected their investments with extreme prejudice. The transformation was complete, but the real test was yet to come. 3 months after Marcus Rivera first modified the black Escalade, his relationship with Carlos Mendoza's organization had evolved into a steady, profitable arrangement that had completely transformed his financial situation. Rivera's Automotive now operated with a dual purpose: legitimate auto repair during regular business hours, and specialized modification work for the cartel during evenings and weekends. Marcus had developed a routine that allowed him to maintain the illusion of normalcy while accommodating his increasingly lucrative but dangerous side business. He hired 2 part-time employees to handle routine repairs, which freed him to focus on the complex modification work that now provided the majority of his income. The shop's books showed a modest but sustainable legitimate business, while the real profits were carefully hidden in cash deposits made to various accounts across the city. The arrangement had worked smoothly until the morning when everything changed. Marcus was alone in the shop, having arrived early to complete some paperwork, when he heard the distinctive sound of a damaged vehicle struggling to maintain power. Looking through the bay doors, he saw a silver BMW sedan approaching with obvious mechanical problem, steam rising from the hood, an irregular engine rhythm, and the telltale signs of a vehicle that had been driven hard and was now failing. What immediately caught Marcus's attention was not just the car's condition, but the fact that he recognized it as one of the vehicles he had modified 6 weeks earlier. The BMW belonged to Diego Herrera, one of Carlos's lieutenants, and it had been fitted with some of Marcus's most sophisticated hidden compartments. Diego emerged from the driver's seat, looking uncharacteristically agitated. At 32, he was normally composed and professional, but today his expensive shirt was soaked with sweat, and his eyes darted nervously around the empty garage. "Marcus, I need your help," Diego said without preamble. "The car broke down about 10 miles from the border crossing. Engine overheated, and I can't risk taking it to anyone else." Marcus nodded, already moving toward the vehicle. "What happened?" "Radiator leak, I think. Started small but got worse fast. I barely made it here." As Marcus popped the hood and began his assessment, Diego paced nervously nearby. The damage was significant, but repairable. A ruptured radiator hose had caused the engine to overheat, which had in turn damaged several other components. "It would take several hours to fix properly. I can have it running by this afternoon," Marcus told Diego. "But you'll need to leave it here while I work." Diego's expression showed obvious conflict. "How long exactly?" 4, maybe 5 hours for a proper repair. "I could do a temporary fix in an hour, but it won't last." "Do the temporary fix," Diego decided quickly. "I need to get this car out of here as soon as possible." Marcus began working on the immediate problem, but as he did, he noticed something unusual. The car's hidden compartments, which should have been empty after a border crossing, appeared to be loaded. The vehicle's suspension was compressed in a way that indicated significant weight, and there were subtle signs that the concealed storage areas were occupied. This was highly irregular. In Marcus's experience, the vehicles were always empty when they returned from their runs. The whole point of the sophisticated concealment systems was to transport cargo across the border, after which it would be unloaded and distributed through other channels. A loaded vehicle returning to El Paso suggested that something had gone wrong with the planned operation. As Marcus worked on the radiator repair, his curiosity grew. Diego's nervousness, the unexpected cargo, and the urgency to get the vehicle mobile again all suggested that this was not a routine mechanical problem. But Marcus had learned to suppress his curiosity about his client's activities, focusing instead on the technical challenges of his work. It was when Diego stepped outside to make a phone call that Marcus's carefully maintained ignorance came to an abrupt end. While adjusting the vehicle's position to access the damaged radiator hose, Marcus accidentally triggered one of the hidden panel releases. The mechanism, which he had designed to be sensitive enough to open with a light touch when activated properly, responded to the inadvertent pressure from his elbow. As he worked in the cramped engine compartment, the panel slid open silently, revealing a compartment that Marcus had built to hold approximately 50 pounds of cargo. What he saw inside made him freeze in shock. The compartment was packed with bundles of cash, not the few $1,000s that might represent payment for a small drug transaction, but stack after stack of $100 bills bound with rubber bands and plastic wrap. Marcus's experience with cash from his cartel work allowed him to estimate quantities quickly, and what he was looking at represented far more money than he had ever seen in one place. His hands shaking slightly, Marcus opened the adjacent compartment. More cash, organized in the same systematic way. A quick mental calculation suggested that each compartment contained somewhere between $1 and $2 million, and the BMW had 4 such compartments. Marcus closed the panels quickly and resumed his work on the radiator, but his mind was racing. $7 million, possibly more, hidden in a vehicle that should have been emptied. Diego's nervousness suddenly made perfect sense. He was transporting an enormous amount of money, far more than would normally be moved in a single vehicle. When Diego returned from his phone call, Marcus forced himself to maintain a normal demeanor while he completed the temporary repair. But internally, he was processing the implications of what he had discovered. This wasn't routine cartel business. This was something much bigger and potentially much more dangerous. All set, Marcus announced, closing the hood. The temporary fix should get you where you need to go, but you'll want to do a proper repair soon. Diego nodded, already moving toward the driver's seat. What do I owe you? Don't worry about it, Marcus replied. Consider it part of our ongoing arrangement. After Diego drove away, Marcus stood in his empty garage trying to process what had just happened. $7 million in cash, transported in a vehicle that should have been empty, by a man who was clearly operating outside normal procedures. The most logical explanation was that Diego had stolen the money and was now trying to escape with it. But if that was true, it meant that Marcus had just helped a thief escape with a fortune that belonged to some very dangerous people. And when those people discovered the theft, they would undoubtedly investigate everyone who had been in contact with Diego, including the mechanic who had repaired his getaway vehicle. Marcus spent the rest of the day in a state of growing anxiety. He tried to focus on routine work, but his mind kept returning to the implications of what he had witnessed. If Diego had indeed stolen cartel money, the consequences would be swift and brutal. The cartels did not tolerate theft, and they were notorious for making examples of anyone who crossed them. But as the hours passed, Marcus began to consider another possibility, one that was both more tempting and more terrifying than simply being an unwitting accomplice to theft. What if Diego never made it to his destination? What if the temporary repair failed? Or what if he was intercepted by cartel security? Or what if any number of other mishaps befell him before he could escape with the money? In that case, the $7 million would be lost to everyone: Diego, the cartel, and anyone else who might have a claim to it. The idea that began forming in Marcus's mind was audacious and incredibly dangerous, but it was also potentially like $7 million was enough money to disappear completely, to start over somewhere far from El Paso and the reach of the cartels. It was enough to ensure Sofia's future, to pay for his ex-wife's medical treatment, and to live comfortably for the rest of his life. But it would also mean stealing from people who killed anyone who crossed them. And it would require Marcus to abandon everything he had built in El Paso: his business, his home, his entire life. As evening approached, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He began researching Diego's likely route, using his knowledge of border crossing procedures and cartel operations to predict where the BMW might be vulnerable. The temporary repair he had performed was designed to fail under stress, and Marcus knew exactly when and where that failure was most likely to occur. What Marcus didn't fully appreciate was that by even considering this course of action, he was crossing a line that would make him a target regardless of whether he actually followed through. The cartels had survived and prospered by maintaining absolute control over their operations, and anyone who possessed knowledge that could threaten that control became a liability that needed to be eliminated. As Marcus locked up his shop that evening and began planning what would either be the biggest mistake or the greatest opportunity of his life, he was already a marked man. The only question was whether he would realize it in time to save himself. The $7 million represented more than just money. It represented a test of Marcus's character, his courage, and his survival instincts. And in the next 24 hours, he would discover which of those qualities would prove strongest when everything he had ever known was at stake. Marcus Rivera spent the night after discovering the $7 million in a state of fevered planning. Sleep was impossible as his mind raced through scenarios, contingencies, and 1,000 details that would determine whether his audacious plan would succeed or result in his death. By dawn, he had made his decision. he would intercept Diego's BMW, take the money, and disappear forever. The plan he developed was built on his intimate knowledge of both the vehicle's mechanical vulnerabilities and the cartel's operational patterns. Marcus knew that Diego would likely take Highway 54 north toward Las Cruces, then connect to Interstate 25 toward Albuquerque, route that would take him through a stretch of desolate desert, where a breakdown would leave him isolated and vulnerable. The temporary radiator repair Marcus had performed was designed to fail under sustained highway driving. The patch would hold for city driving, but would rupture under the pressure and heat of extended high-speed travel. Marcus calculated that the failure would occur somewhere between mile marker 47 and 52 on Highway 54, in a section of road with minimal traffic and no nearby services. Marcus loaded his pickup truck with tools, spare parts, and everything he would need for what he told himself was a rescue mission. He also packed a go bag with cash, identification documents, and essential personal items, preparation for a disappearance that he hoped would look like the tragic result of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The timing had to be perfect. Marcus needed to arrive at the breakdown location shortly after. Diego's car failed, but before any other assistance could arrive. Too early, and Diego would be suspicious. Too late, and other cartel members might respond to Diego's calls for help. Marcus positioned himself at a truck stop near mile marker 40 and waited. His hands were steady as he monitored the radio scanner he had brought to listen for any emergency calls or cartel communications. At 2:47 p.m., he heard what he was waiting for, a frustrated voice speaking rapid Spanish, reporting a vehicle breakdown and requesting immediate assistance. Marcus drove north slowly, scanning the roadside until he spotted the silver BMW pulled over near mile marker 49, steam rising from its hood, exactly as he had predicted. Diego was standing beside the car, phone pressed to his ear, gesticulating angrily as he spoke to someone who was clearly not providing the immediate help he needed. Marcus pulled over and approached with the demeanor of a good Samaritan mechanic who had happened upon a stranded motorist. Car trouble, Marcus called out, grabbing his toolbox from the truck bed. Diego's relief was immediate and obvious. Marcus, thank God, the radiator completely blew out. I'm stuck here. Let me take a look, Marcus said, popping the hood and examining the damage with professional concern. Yeah, this is bad. The temporary patch failed, and now you've got multiple problems. This is going to take some time to fix properly. Diego's expression shifted to panic. How much time? Out here, with the parts I'd need to bring from town. 3, maybe 4 hours minimum. I can't wait that long, Diego said, his voice tight with stress. I need to be somewhere tonight. Marcus nodded sympathetically. I understand. Look, I can give you a ride back to El Paso, and we can arrange to have the car towed later. You can deal with whatever business you have and come back for the vehicle tomorrow. Diego considered this option, but Marcus could see the conflict in his expression. Leaving $7 million unattended in a broken-down car was not an acceptable risk, but Diego also couldn't afford to miss whatever appointment was driving his urgency. Actually, Marcus continued, there might be another option. I could stay here and work on the car while you take my truck and handle your business. I'll have it running by the time you get back. This suggestion clearly appealed to Diego, but he was still hesitant. I don't know, ... Look, we've been working together for months, Marcus said. You know you can trust me, and honestly, I could use the overtime pay. The mention of payment seemed to tip the balance. Diego reached into his wallet and pulled out a thick roll of bills. Fix the car, keep it safe, and there's a $5,000 bonus in it for you. Marcus accepted the money and the keys to the BMW, watching as Diego transferred a small overnight bag to the pickup truck. I'll be back by midnight, Diego said. Have it running and ready to go. After Diego drove away in Marcus's truck, Marcus was alone with $7 million in cash and a disabled vehicle on a deserted stretch of highway. The next phase of his plan required precise timing and nerves of steel. But Marcus began by actually working on the car's radiator, making legitimate repairs that would restore the vehicle to working condition. But while he worked, he also emptied the hidden compartments, transferring bundle after bundle of cash to his own bags. The money was even more than he had estimated, closer to $8 million in total. The physical act of handling that much cash was surreal. Each bundle represented more money than Marcus typically made in a year. and there were dozens of bundles as he loaded the money into his truck. Marcus felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror that made his hands shake and his heart race. With the money secured, Marcus completed the radiator repair and tested the engine to ensure it was running properly. Then came the most crucial part of his plan, creating a plausible story for what would happen next. Marcus drove the BMW to a remote location about 5 miles from the breakdown site, a place where the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, and the nearest road was barely visible. He parked the car, wiped down all surfaces to remove his fingerprints, and then began the walk back to where he had left his truck. The story he would tell was simple. After completing the repair, he had taken the BMW for a test drive to ensure everything was working properly. During that drive, he had been ambushed by unknown assailants who had stolen the vehicle and left him stranded in the desert. He had walked for hours before reaching a point where he could call for help. To make the story convincing, Marcus inflicted minor injuries on himself, scrapes and bruises consistent with being roughed up and forced to walk through desert terrain. He also disposed of his tools and any other evidence that might contradict his account of being a victim rather than a perpetrator. When Diego returned at midnight to find Marcus's truck but no BMW, his initial reaction was confusion rather than suspicion. Marcus, appearing disheveled and injured, told his story with the conviction of a man who had genuinely experienced trauma. "They came out of nowhere," Marcus said, his voice shaking with what appeared to be shock. "3 men, maybe 4. They had guns. They took the car and told me to walk away and forget what I saw." Diego's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, and finally a cold calculation that Marcus recognized as extremely dangerous. But Diego's immediate concern was not Marcus's story. It was the realization that $8 million in cartel money had just vanished into the desert. "Did you see which direction they went?" Diego demanded. "North, I think. But it was dark, and I was pretty shaken up." Diego spent the next hour making frantic phone calls, summoning cartel security teams to search the area. Marcus cooperated fully with their questions, maintaining his story consistently while internally marveling at how well his plan was working. The search teams found the abandoned BMW, exactly where Marcus had left it. But of course, the hidden compartments were now empty. The sophisticated concealment systems that Marcus had designed worked perfectly in reverse. There was no obvious evidence that the compartments had ever contained anything. To the cartel investigators, it appeared that professional thieves had somehow discovered the money's location and executed a precision robbery. The fact that they had abandoned the vehicle suggested they were more interested in the cash than in the car itself, which supported the theory that this was an inside job by people who knew exactly what they were looking for. Diego was questioned, ostensibly about who might have known about the money's location and transport route. Marcus watched these interrogations with carefully concealed satisfaction, knowing that Diego's own theft of the money meant he couldn't provide complete information without incriminating himself. Within 48 hours, both Diego and Marcus had been cleared of direct involvement in the theft, though both remained under suspicion. Diego because he had been responsible for the money's security, and Marcus because he had been the last person to have access to the vehicle. But Marcus had anticipated this scrutiny and had prepared accordingly. Over the following weeks, he maintained his normal routine, continuing to operate his garage and even accepting new modification work from the cartel. He showed no signs of sudden wealth or changed behavior that might indicate he had come into a large sum of money. The $8 million remained hidden in a storage unit across town, untouched, while Marcus waited for the investigation to cool down. He knew that the cartel would eventually move on to other concerns, but he also knew that he could never truly be safe as long as he remained in El Paso. 3 months after the theft, Marcus began implementing the final phase of his plan. He gradually liquidated his legitimate assets, selling his garage to a competitor and converting his possessions to cash. To anyone watching, it appeared that the stress of the robbery and the ongoing cartel suspicion had convinced him to leave the auto repair business and start over somewhere else. Marcus's cover story was that he was moving to Phoenix to work for a large automotive chain, a job that would provide steady income and distance from the dangerous associations that had nearly gotten him killed. He even went so far as to apply for and accept such a position, creating a paper trail that would support his stated intentions. But Marcus Rivera never arrived in Phoenix. Instead, He drove to Denver, where he had arranged new identity documents and a complete transformation of his appearance. The $8 million was converted to bearer bonds and cryptocurrency, financial instruments that would allow him to access his wealth from anywhere in the world without creating traceable connections to his former identity. The man who had been Marcus Rivera ceased to exist on a Tuesday morning in November, replaced by David Chen, a software consultant with a carefully constructed background and a legitimate business that provided cover for his new lifestyle. 6 months later, David Chen was living in a modest but comfortable house in Portland, Oregon, running a small technology consulting firm that provided just enough legitimate income to explain his lifestyle without attracting attention. The $8 million remained largely untouched, invested conservatively and accessed only in small amounts that wouldn't trigger financial monitoring systems. Marcus had achieved the perfect vanishing. He had stolen a fortune from one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in North America, and had disappeared so completely that even he sometimes forgot who he used to be. The cartel had never solved the theft. Diego had eventually been eliminated for his role in losing the money, and the case had become just another unsolved mystery in the violent world of border crime. But Marcus knew that true safety was an illusion. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he understood that the cartels never forgot and never forgave. His new life was built on the foundation of a crime that could never be fully erased. And every day of freedom was a gift that could be revoked without warning. Still, as David Chen sat in his Portland office, managing the legitimate business that provided his cover, he couldn't help but smile at the irony. A simple mechanic from El Paso had outsmarted some of the most sophisticated criminals in the world, and had done it using nothing more than mechanical knowledge, careful planning, and the kind of desperate courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. The $8 million had bought him a new life. But more importantly, it had brought him the knowledge that sometimes the most impossible dreams can become reality if you're willing to risk everything to achieve them. The end. Disclaimer: this story is completely fictional and created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.